Welcome to another episode of Infographic Instant with Brian Michael. This episode is conducted in collaboration with CASE, the Center for Economic and Social Research. In this episode, we'll be looking at SAHOL, or Sabanci Holdings, a Turkish company that's involved in banking, insurance, industrial production, among other things that we will talk about in today's episode. Just to give you a heads up, we expect a price target of 12 Turkish liras, up from 10 Turkish liras, and this represents a 20% gain in the share price over the next 6 months to 1 year. So, what is Sabanci Holdings? Sabanci Holdings has roughly 20 billion Turkish liras in market capitalization, or 10 billion US dollars, and it's focused mostly on finance. 40% of its revenue in 2013 came from finance, roughly 25% came from energy, and roughly 12% came from industry. Several financial ratios indicate that Sabanci Holdings is an attractive investment. Its price-to-book ratio is 0.63. Its price-to-earnings ratio is roughly 14.25, at a time when the S&P is easily over 20. Its price to revenue is 1.14, which means that the revenue the company earns almost pays the amount of money investors give to the shares within 1.5 years. And its return on equity is roughly 4.5%, well above the rate of return in bonds. Now, let's look at each of the divisions of Sabanci Holdings, which you see in front of you. We've divided the holding up into its constituent parts: banking, as represented by Akbank; insurance, represented by Aksigorta and Aviva SA; energy SA, its cement holdings, which consists of Akcan and Jim SA; retail, which is Techno and Carrefour; and several industrial holdings, comprising the names you see in front of you. Looking at revenues from 2013 to 2014, we see banking revenues increased the least at 2%, insurance increased at 13%, energy revenues clipped along, doubling in that period, retail at 10%, cement and industrials roughly at 30%, and other revenue increasing about 6%. The total increase in revenue over this 1 year period has been 24%. Looking at the attractiveness of the various segments that Sabanci competes in, we see that banking has increased over the last 5 years by about 4 times. This represents a broad growth in Turkish banking markets. Insurance sector has increased very rapidly, not only because of the quick expansion of shadow banking, but also because of attractive holdings from Aksigorta and Aviva. Aksigorta had roughly 16% increase and Aviva 26% increase in the last 5 years. Energy markets have been growing at roughly 30%. Its cement holdings over the last 5 years have increased at about 12%, retail at about 26%, and its various industrial holdings of fabrics, fibers, tires have also increased very rapidly over the period. So while American markets have been increasing very rapidly over the time period, Sabanci certainly represents no slack in terms of a potential investment opportunity. Now, what advantages can Sabanci give to the retail investor? Well, first, unlike American investors, Sabanci gives access to hard-to-reach markets. Those particularly in Macedonia, Serbia, the Baltic region in general, as well as Central Asia. We're looking at Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and even hard-to-reach markets like Iran. The other advantage derives from the research and development expenditures that Sabanci has been making over time. We give a link to a CASE research note where we compare Turkish R&D policies with Polish policies, and CASE research has indicated that it is because of this R&D support to Turkish industry writ large that we see some of the fast growth rates that we have talked about in this infographic instant. Now, turning our attention to the stock chart, we see that Sabanci Holdings has increased over time relatively well compared with two benchmarks. From roughly 2011 to the middle of 2014, we see that Sabanci Holdings share price has increased about 36% in comparison with the iShares Turkish ETF, which has increased only about 16%, has decreased 16% over the same time period. That means that if you invested in the broadish Turkish market, you would have lost money, whereas if you invested directly in Sabanci Holdings, you would have gained 36%. However, of course, given unusual recent macroeconomic developments, the S&P index has increased 54%. Of course, this is in large part due to the Federal Reserve easing over the last several years through could be 4 rounds of quantitative easing. Now, let's turn our attention to some of Sabanci's financials. Sabanci is in a very healthy position, having increased its cash holdings from 2 million to roughly 4.5 million. Current assets have almost doubled over the same time period. Total assets have increased by about 30%, and total liabilities have only doubled. So we see that while assets have increased, almost trebled, liabilities have about doubled. Looking at its revenues earned over the period, revenues have increased from roughly 3 million to 4 million, and net revenue in general has increased relatively steadily, though of course not as much as might be expected. As a promising sign, cash from operations has gone from negative to slightly positive. Cash from investing remains negative over much of the period. Cash from financing has turned positive, and change in cash, as a promising sign, has turned positive. So why do we have a price target of 12 Turkish liras, up about 20%? There are 3 factors that we believe drive this increase in price. First relates to banking markets. Banking in Turkey has accelerated very dramatically over the last 4 to 5 years, and we expect these trends to continue, particularly for some underserved markets, particularly in the east part of Turkey. The second reason is because of the growth of electricity markets. Sabanci Holdings has significant investments in renewable energies, and we believe that renewable energies will be a very important segment in the overall energy mix in the next 4 to 5 years in Turkey. And of course, we see an increase in tradables, and the depreciation of the Turkish lira can only improve Sabanci's overall net trade balance with the rest of the world. So it's for those reasons that we believe that Sabanci Holding could be a very attractive investment in the upcoming years. This has been Brian Michael with another Infographic Instant.